In 1997, a young girl ventured into the Arcadian Forest and was never seen again. The village of Verdora had long been forgotten by time, hidden deep in the mist-veiled mountains where the whispers of the world beyond could scarcely reach. Towering trees surrounded the village like sentinels, their ancient boughs blocking out the sun, casting the cobbled streets in a permanent shadow. It was the kind of place where secrets took root and legends grew wild, twisting into shapes that none could distinguish from truth. Among those legends, one stood out: the Arcadian Deer. The creature, or whatever it truly was said to appear in the woods once every few generations, its very presence a harbinger of change, of something deep, ancient, and deadly. And it was to this village, this forgotten place, that Emma Forsyth had come. Emma was not a woman who easily succumbed to fear. Driven by an unrelenting need to find answers, she had journeyed for weeks across treacherous roads, through rugged landscapes, all to uncover the mystery of her brother's disappearance. Lucas. A year had passed since he vanished without a trace, leaving only a vague trail of whispers and an unsettling cryptic letter he had sent just days before he was lost to the world. The letter had been short, almost hurriedly written, but the words stuck in her mind, echoed in her thoughts like a cruel riddle. "Find me in Verdora. The deer knows." She had come here, to the very heart of the mountains, driven by the chilling certainty that whatever happened to Lucas, this village held the key. The locals didn't speak much to outsiders, and when they did, their eyes would dart nervously, as if the very mention of the deer was enough to stir the shadows around them. As Emma entered the village, the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker with mystery. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and weighed down your chest. The houses, old and crooked, leaned in on each other as though they were sharing dark secrets. Emma's boots clicked sharply on the cobblestone path, the only sound breaking the stillness. And then she saw it markings on the trees. At first, they seemed innocuous, just strange carvings, deep grooves carved into the bark. But as Emma stopped to examine them, her heart began to race. They weren't random. They formed a paterna symbol that made her skin crawl. A series of intertwined lines, like a crude drawing of a creature, a deer. The sensation of being watched grew stronger, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond her vision, hidden within the thick forest that surrounded the village. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she continued walking, a shiver creeping down her spine. Every instinct told her to turn back, to flee, but she couldn't. Not when she was so close to the truth. She reached the village square where an old wooden sign stood. It was barely legible, but she could make out the name Verdora. The sign swayed in the breeze, creaking like a warning. Emma pulled the letter from her coat pocket, its edges worn and faded from the journey. She studied it again, her mind racing. The cryptic words were both a clue and a challenge, but it was the last part that had haunted her. Follow the trail of the deer. The answer lies beneath the moon's gaze. A soft rustling sound pulled her from her thoughts. She turned, but no one was in sight, just the tree standing still, yet alive with something she couldn't quite name. A voice cut through the silence. "You've come for answers, haven't you?" The voice was low, rough, but there was an unsettling calm to it. An old man stood at the edge of the square, his face weathered and lined with years of living in solitude. He wore a faded coat, and his eyes were sharp, knowing. It was Jonas, a name Emma recognized from the letter. He had known Lucas once, before the disappearance. Emma stepped closer, holding her breath. "You should leave, miss," Jonas said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some things are better left undisturbed. The Arcadian Deer, it's not something you want to chase after, not unless you're ready to pay the price." A sudden gust of wind howled through the village, and the trees groaned, as if the forest itself was trying to warn her. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. "Why don't you want me to find the truth?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping in. Jonas didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked into the shadow of the trees, his back disappearing into the darkness of the forest. Emma stared after him, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. She looked down at the letter once more, the eerie feeling of being watched intensifying. The markings on the trees, the voice of warning. There was something more to this village, something that stretched beyond the supernatural, something that had claimed her brother. She took a deep breath and set off toward the woods, the map in her hand shaking ever so slightly. Each step she took felt heavier, laden with both dread and determination. But as she walked deeper into the village, a strange noise echoed from the wood, soft at first, then louder. It was a low, resonating sound, like the call of a creature, something not quite human. And then, the trees parted, revealing a shadow in the distance, a silhouette standing at the edge of the forest. A deer, but not just any deer. Its antlers twisted and curled in unnatural ways, and its eyes cold, unblinking, fixed directly on Emma. The letter had spoken of the Arcadian deer, but this was no mere legend. Cliffhanger. The deer's eyes never wavered, its gaze piercing through her, as if it knew her soul. Emma took a tentative step forward, and the creature's form shifted, vanishing into the shadows of the forest. The letter's final words echoed in her mind. The answer lies beneath the moon's gaze. The forest felt colder now, as though it had swallowed the sun whole, and Emma, alone with nothing but the sound of her own breath, knew one thing: the search for Lucas had only just begun. The investigation begins. Emma stood in the village square, the dense fog rolling through the narrow streets, pressing against her like the weight of the mystery she had come to unravel. She had expected to find answers, here at least, some semblance of truth, but all she encountered so far were strange looks and uneasy whispers. The villagers knew something, that much was clear. But what exactly? Her brother Lucas had disappeared over a year ago, and the trail had gone cold long before it led her to Verdora. She had come to uncover the truth, but something about this place, about the people who lived here, made the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. She wasn't sure if she was closer to finding her brother, or if she had stumbled into something far darker than she could have ever imagined. Emma paused in front of the small, dimly lit shop of an old woman named Margaret, whose wrinkled eyes followed her every move. The old woman was silent as she dusted a shelf, her gaze flickering nervously when Emma caught her eye. "I wonder," Emma said, her voice calm but firm, "do you know anything about the Arcadian deer?" The question seemed to rattle Margaret. She lowered the broom she was holding and glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. After a long pause, she muttered under her breath, "Best you don't ask. Some things are better left undisturbed." Emma's pulse quickened. "And my brother?" she pressed, stepping closer. "Did he ask about it before he disappeared?" The woman stiffened, her face twisting with a mixture of fear and anger. "Leave it, girl. Some mysteries should die with the forest." But Emma wasn't the kind of person to walk away from a mystery. Not when it was personal. Not when it concerned Lucas. She nodded curtly, thanked Margaret, and left, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the old woman was hiding something she wasn't prepared to face. As Emma made her way down the street, she noticed a young woman standing near the well. Layla. Emma had seen her around the village, a quiet figure who always seemed to be watching. There was something in her eyes, something not entirely innocent, like she knew more than she let on. "Layla," Emma called out, her voice determined. "Do you know anything about the Arcadian deer?" Layla looked up, startled, as if Emma had caught her off guard. But after a moment, her expression softened, and she stepped closer. "The deer," Layla began, her voice low, almost reverent. "It's not just a myth, it's a curse, a guardian. The forest has always protected this village, but the deer, it chooses who it reveals itself to. Only those with deep ties to the land can truly see it." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Ties to the land. She remembered the letter. Her brother's last words. "Find me in Verdora. The deer knows." "You've seen it?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Layla shook her head slowly. "Not seen it, but heard the stories. It's been years since it's been spotted. But when it comes, things change." Before Emma could press for more answers, a harsh voice cut through the air. "Don't listen to her. Jonas's gravelly voice came from behind, and Emma turned to see the old man approaching. The girl's too young to understand. She's been feeding you fairy tales, and you're letting it cloud your judgment. Emma bristled, but kept her composure. I need answers, Jonas. Lucas came here. He knew something. I need to understand what happened. Jonas's face softened, but his eyes remained sharp, like he could see through her every intention. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. I knew your brother. He was stubborn, too stubborn. You won't find what you're looking for here. The deer is not something you want to invite into your life. Why? Emma asked, her voice cracking. Why can't you just tell me the truth? Jonas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned and walked away without another word, leaving Emma with a gnawing sense of unease. It felt as though the village itself was closing in around her, its secrets too thick and tangled to unravel. Emma stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing with questions, but then, as if by instinct, her hand moved to the letter. The one Lucas had sent her, the last clue he had left behind. She unfolded it again, tracing the cryptic words, and that's when she saw it, a hidden message, faint and barely visible against the paper. At first, she thought it was a smudge, but on closer inspection, she realized it was a map. The map pointed straight to the heart of the forest, to an abandoned mansion marked by an intricate symbol, something familiar, something she had seen before in the village, the deer's sacred ground. Her breath caught in her throat. A mansion, a place tied to the deer. Could this be where Lucas had gone before his disappearance? Without hesitation, she stuffed the letter back into her coat pocket, determined now more than ever to find out the truth. The villagers could warn her all they wanted, but Emma had come too far to turn back now. Her brother's trail led into the woods, and she would follow it no matter where it took her. As she made her way toward the edge of the village, the shadows of the trees stretched longer, darker, as if the forest itself was waiting for her. She felt the weight of the village's silence pressing in on her, but she couldn't shake the thought the mansion could hold the answers she needed. She had to go there. She had to see it for herself. Cliffhanger. Just as Emma took her first step toward the edge of the forest, a sudden rustle in the bushes caught her attention. She stopped, heart pounding, every muscle frozen in place. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward, their face obscured by the darkness. A soft voice whispered from the shadows, "You shouldn't have come, Emma. You're already too late." The suspects. Twists start. The mansion loomed ahead of Emma, its broken windows casting eerie reflections in the twilight. The dense forest surrounding it seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, its trees standing like sentinels, watching her every move. Her pulse raced as she stepped closer to the entrance, but her feet felt heavy, as if the very ground beneath her was reluctant to let her go any further. The map had led her here, to this cursed mansion. But what was it about this place that had drawn her brother Lucas into its web of mystery? Why had he come here? And why had he disappeared? A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to move forward. She was here to find the truth, no matter the cost. The first person she saw upon entering the mansion grounds was Jonas. The old man was standing at the edge of the overgrown garden, his back hunched with age, his weathered face unreadable. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment she thought she saw a flicker of recognition, of fleeting emotion that quickly vanished. "You're here," he rasped, his voice hoarse from years of disuse. "I knew you'd come eventually. Your brother, Lucas. He came here too, didn't he? But you won't find what you're looking for inside." Emma stepped closer, feeling the weight of his words settle heavily in her chest. "Why not? What's inside this mansion, Jonas? What are you hiding?" Jonas's face hardened, and he glanced nervously toward the woods. "It's not what you think. The mansion. It has a history. A dark one. But I won't be the one to tell you. Some things are better left untouched." His voice trembled with the weight of his own warning. But Emma was determined to push further. "You know something, Jonas," she said, her voice steady but intense. "If you really cared about Lucas, you'd help me. You'd tell me what happened to him." Jonas's eyes flickered with a strange emotion, regret, fear. But before he could respond, a sudden rustle came from the woods. Emma's heart skipped a beat, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Jonas's lips tightened. "Don't trust anyone in this village," he muttered, "and especially not Layla. She—" Before he could finish, the sound of footsteps interrupted him. Emma turned to find Layla, the wild-eyed villager, emerging from the trees. Her eyes were wide with excitement, and her breath came in quick gasps. She seemed to glow with an energy that Emma couldn't quite place. "You've come for it, haven't you?" Layla asked, her voice low and urgent. "For the truth. But do you understand what you're dealing with? The Arcadian Deer. It's not just some myth. It's ancient, a force beyond our understanding. And your brother, Lucas, he found something, didn't he?" Emma's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? What did he find, Layla?" Lila stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Emma's. "I can feel it in you. You're tied to this place, to the land itself. Just like him. He was on the brink of discovering the secret of the deer, but he was too naive to understand. He thought he could control it, but the deer doesn't obey anyone." Emma felt a chill crawl up her spine. "So you think Lucas found the deer? And then what? It took him?" Layla's eyes flickered, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her cloak. "Not took him. Changed him. The deer chooses who it reveals itself to, and it reveals itself to those who are ready to embrace its power." "Power?" Emma echoed, her voice rising. "What power?" Before Layla could respond, a deep voice boomed from the shadows. "I told you to stay away from this place." Emma spun around to see Daniel, a tall, reclusive man standing at the edge of the mansion's porch, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and something darker fear, perhaps. His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, Emma felt as if he could see straight through her. "Who are you to tell me what to do?" Emma snapped, her patience running thin. "I'm the one who's been warning people for years," Daniel replied, his voice low and dangerous. "I've heard things that shouldn't exist in this world, sounds in the woods, whispers in the night. But none of it is real, right? It's just a story, a legend. But trust me, Emma, there are things in those woods that will make you wish you never came here." Emma's gaze hardened. "You're telling me there's something out there?" Daniel nodded grimly. "The mansion is just the beginning. The deer, it's part of something much bigger. You think your brother just vanished. He unlocked something in that forest. Something wrong. And now, you're in danger." Emma stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. Could it be true? Was her brother's disappearance linked to the deer? And if it was, what had he uncovered? But before she could respond, a sudden rustling from the woods broke the silence. Emma's heart raced as a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. The figure stepped forward, revealing a tall, slender silhouette cloaked in black. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the figure raised a hand, and a chilling voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come here, Emma. You should have stayed away." Cliffhanger. Emma's blood ran cold as the figure stepped into the moonlight, revealing an all-too-familiar face. It was Lucas. But there was something wrong about him. His eyes were empty, his skin pale, and stretched too thin. He looked like her brother, but not. And then, in a voice that didn't sound quite right, he whispered, "The deer, it's waiting for you." The Midpoint. Emma's heart pounded as she stepped deeper into the mansion, the dust-heavy air thick with the weight of secrets. Every creaking floorboard beneath her feet felt like a warning. Every gust of wind that rattled the windows seemed to whisper of things hidden just out of sight. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, but there was a palpable sense of something still lingering, something watching, waiting. Her mind raced back to what Layla and Daniel had said about the deer, about the power it held. Could it be true? Was there a creature in the woods that could grant immortality? Was Lucas really searching for it before he vanished? What had he uncovered? What had he done? Her fingers trembled as she traced the wall near the grand staircase, her eyes scanning for any sign of a hidden doorway. She knew there had to be more. She had always felt it. The mansion had been too quiet, too empty. There had to be something buried deep within its walls. And then, as if the house itself had been waiting for her to find it, She felt the faintest indentation in the wall near an old dusty tapestry. Her heart skipped a beat. Slowly, carefully, she pressed on it, and with a soft groan, the wall shifted, revealing a narrow passage leading down into the dark. A chill ran through her as she stepped into the dimly lit corridor. The air was colder here, the silence heavier. The only sound was the rhythmic echo of her own breath, quick and shallow as her feet carried her deeper. She couldn't explain why she felt drawn to this place. It was like some invisible force was pulling her forward, urging her to uncover the truth. But what truth? The passage led her into a small, stone-walled room, hidden beneath the mansion's foundation. It was nothing like the opulent room she had seen earlier. This space felt ancient, forsaken, as if it had been forgotten for centuries. Old wooden crates sat stacked against the walls, their contents long since rotted away. But in the far corner of the room, a small desk stood, covered in dust and cobwebs. Atop the desk lay a collection of journals, their leather covers cracked and faded with age. Emma's pulse quickened as she approached, her fingers itching to open them. The first journal she pulled from the pile was heavier than she expected, its pages yellowed and fragile. She began to read, and as the words blurred together, she realized this wasn't just some old family diary. These were the journals of villagers from decades centuries ago. Each one chronicled the same thing, the legend of the Arcadian Deer. The deer, it seemed, was no mere creature of myth. It was a being of immense power, one that could grant eternal life, but at a price that could never be undone. The legend spoke of a hidden realm in the forest, a place where the deer resided. Those who were chosen could cross into this realm, and in doing so, they would be granted immortality in exchange. They had to give up something precious, something irreplaceable. For some, it was their humanity. For others, their soul. No one had ever returned unchanged. Emma's hands shook as she flipped through the pages, each more chilling than the last. One entry described a villager who had ventured into the forest seeking the deer, only to return with his eyes wide and blank, as if all life had drained from him. Another told of a young woman who disappeared into the woods, her body found years later, still young, but her face twisted in an eternal scream. And then, in the final journal, she found a name, Lucas. The words seemed to jump off the page, as if written just for her. He's not gone, not truly. He ventured into the woods on the night of the blood moon. He sought the deer, seeking immortality. But the deer demands more than just the body. It takes the soul, the spirit. It will claim him, but it will leave a shadow behind, a copy. Her breath caught in her throat. A copy. Emma's mind reeled. What had Lucas done? Had he really gone after the deer, as the villagers said? Had he sought immortality at the cost of his very soul? A soft, almost imperceptible rustle sounded behind her. She spun around, her pulse racing. The room was empty, but the air had shifted. It felt charged, as though the very space around her had come alive. Then, a voice, a whisper, cold and distant, echoed in the stillness. "You've found it, haven't you, Emma?" She froze, her blood turning to ice as the voice came again, this time clearer, closer, like a breath against her ear. "Your brother never left. He's still here with me." Emma's heart slammed against her ribs as she turned, but there was no one in the room, no figure standing in the doorway, no shadow moving in the corner, only silence. But the words lingered in the air, wrapping around her like a shroud. Her head spun. What had she uncovered? What had she truly found here? Was Lucas alive, in some twisted form? Was he still in the forest, still seeking the deer's promise? As Emma backed away, she noticed something else in the corner of the room. A small, weathered chest. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to run from the mansion, to forget everything she had learned. But the chest seemed to beckon her. She could feel it calling to her. Against her better judgment, she approached it. The moment her fingers brushed the latch, the mansion seemed to groan, as if awakening from a long slumber. She hesitated, but then the chest clicked open on its own, revealing a single shining object, a small, delicate silver pendant. Her breath caught in her throat as she picked it up. It was shaped like a deer, its antlers intricate and sharp, its eyes hollow and unblinking. And inside the pendant, there was something strange, a tiny, glowing stone. Before Emma could process what she was holding, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The air grew thick, oppressive, and she heard the voice again, this time loud and insistent. "It's too late now. You've awakened it." Cliffhanger. The walls of the mansion shook violently, the floor cracking beneath her as the room seemed to collapse inward. Emma's vision blurred as the light from the pendant flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. She turned, desperate to escape, but the door was gone. The only way out was through the forest, and she could hear something moving there, something fast and hungry. Twist. A chilling discovery. Emma's hands shook as she turned the brittle pages of the journal, the leather creaking as if protesting the intrusion. Her mind raced, trying to process the horrors she had just read. The Arcadian Deer, an ancient creature that granted immortality, but at a devastating cost. Was Lucas really part of this twisted story? Had he ventured into the woods, as the journal suggested? The idea felt impossible, yet the evidence mounted proof that the dark legend was far more than just myth. Her fingers hovered over the next page, her breath caught in her throat as her eyes slowly scanned the text. Then, she froze. There, tucked between the pages, was something she hadn't noticed before. An old photograph. It had slipped from the fragile binding and now lay there in front of her, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. Emma's heartbeat quickened. This wasn't just any photograph, this was a picture of Lucas. She stared at the image, her chest tightening with disbelief. There he was, her brother, standing amidst the thick, twisted trees of the forest. But something was horribly wrong. His face, once full of life and adventure, was now pale, his expression frozen in a mixture of fear and agony. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring directly at the lens, as if he knew what was about to happen to him. But it wasn't the fear that struck her most. It was the deer standing beside him. The creature was massive, its fur gleaming with an otherworldly sheen, its eyes glowing with an eerie intensity. The way it towered over Lucas, its presence seemed almost possessive. And then, Emma noticed something even more unsettling. The symbol. A dark, jagged mark was etched across Lucas's chest. It was a symbol she had seen before. Her breath caught as she remembered the strange carvings on the trees outside the mansion, the same markings she had noticed as she ventured deeper into the village. Those markings weren't random. They weren't just the whims of some ancient culture, they were a warning, a curse. Emma's hand trembled as she held the photograph up to the dim light, her mind racing. The symbol, its sharp lines and twisted curves, matched exactly with the ones she had seen painted on the trees. But this wasn't just a sign of some ancient ritual, it was a mark of ownership. The deer had claimed Lucas, and in return, it had branded him. Her eyes blurred with tears, but she blinked them away, trying to focus on the horrifying realization. Lucas hadn't just vanished into thin air. He had made a choice. He had found the deer, and in doing so had lost something far greater than his life. Emma felt a chill crawl up her spine. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the photograph. She knew that somewhere out there the deer still roamed, and it was waiting for her, waiting to claim her too. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. It was faint at first, like a soft rustle of leaves brushing against the stone walls of the mansion. But as Emma's heart pounded in her chest, the sound grew louder, sharper, more deliberate. It was like footsteps, heavy, slow steps approaching from the dark hallway. Someone or something was coming closer. Her pulse raced as the door to the hidden room creaked open, the shadows spilling into the space like a tidal wave. Emma's grip tightened on the photograph, but her mind was elsewhere, caught in the turmoil of the discovery. There was no time to process everything, no time to think. Then, the figure appeared in the doorway, a silhouette, standing just out of the light. For a moment, Emma didn't move. She couldn't. She was frozen, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. Was it a villager? Someone who had come to warn her again? Or was it something worse, something that had come for her, just like it had for Lucas? The figure took a step forward, and a gust of cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the single candle Emma had lit. The darkness closed in around her, and in the silence, the footsteps grew louder. Then, the voice. It was low, guttural, a whisper that seemed to come from the very walls of the mansion itself. "You've seen it now, haven't you?" Emma's breath caught in her throat, her skin prickling with terror. The voice sounded like it was inside her head, but when she looked up, the figure remained still, silent, its face obscured by shadows. Her legs felt weak, as though the floor itself had turned to liquid. The photograph trembled in her hand, and a realization struck her with brutal clarity. The deer wasn't just a myth, it was real. And somehow it was connected to everything in this village: the mansion, the woods, and now her brother. Without thinking, Emma bolted toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, she froze once again. The figure was moving, slowly, deliberately, and in the dark she could just make out its features. It wasn't human. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the glint of something clear, long and sharp, glimmering faintly in the shadows. And then, before she could react, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside the room. Emma backed away, her body shaking uncontrollably as the reality of the situation hit her all at once. The deer had come for her. Cliffhanger. The room fell into total darkness as the creature's presence enveloped her. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed around her. Emma's pulse raced, her mind screaming for her to run. But there was nowhere to escape. The door was locked. The walls seemed to close in. And then, she heard a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of something breathing right behind her. Danger, a haunting presence. The days in the village passed slowly, each one more oppressive than the last. Emma could feel it now, the sense that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't just the strange villagers or the unnerving atmosphere of the mansion. It was the feeling of being watched, like unseen eyes were tracking her every movement. She couldn't shake it. At night, the whispers grew louder, faint, unintelligible murmurs drifting in on the wind. Sometimes she'd wake to find herself tangled in the sheets, drenched in cold sweat, heart racing. But it wasn't just her dreams. The noise, it was real. The crackling of leaves, the snap of twigs. Someone or something was moving just outside her window. One evening, as the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the mansion's overgrown grounds, Emma ventured into the forest. Her breath fogged in the cold air as she walked cautiously between the trees. The silence was deafening, but there was something wrong with it, like the entire world had stopped breathing. Then, just as she reached a clearing, something caught her eye. A glimmer, faint but unmistakable, reflecting in the moonlight. She stepped forward, her boots crunching against the frozen earth, until she found Ithalf buried beneath a patch of thick moss, a small, intricately carved object. Her fingers trembled as she brushed the dirt away, revealing an ancient talisman. Its surface was covered in strange, looping symbols, some of which she recognized marks from the trees, the ones she had seen in the woods near the mansion. As Emma held the talisman in her hands, an unsettling energy surged through her. The air seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping as if the talisman itself were alive, pulsing with power. She couldn't explain it, but the moment her fingers made contact with the smooth surface, the whispers grew louder, closer, more urgent. It was like the forest had suddenly awakened, surrounding her with a presence she couldn't understand. Her heart raced as she examined the talisman more closely. It wasn't just an artifact, it was a key. The markings on it matched the symbols she had seen in the journal and on the trees. And the more she stared at it, the more she realized the talisman wasn't just a relic, it was cursed. There was a deep, ancient power that flowed through it, and it was tied to the Arcadian Deer, to the village, and to Lucas' disappearance. Suddenly, she felt a cold breath on her neck. Emma spun around, her pulse hammering in her chest. Her eyes darted between the trees, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The whispers were louder now, coming from every direction, their source impossible to pinpoint. They felt closer, like they were inside her mind, pressing against her skull. The wind shifted, rustling the leaves, and Emma's eyes snapped back to the talisman in her hand. It had changed. The once faint symbols now gleamed with an unnatural light, and she could swear the talisman moved in her palm just slightly, as if it were alive. Then, through the thick woods, she saw it. A figure tall, imposing, its outline barely visible against the shadows. The figure moved with unnatural speed, gliding between the trees with a fluidity that felt wrong, like it was part of the very forest itself. Emma's breath hitched, her body frozen in place, as she tried to process what she was seeing. It wasn't human, it was something far older, something that didn't belong to this world. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging her to run. But Emma couldn't move. The talisman called to her, its presence pulling her deeper into the forest, deeper into the darkness. She took a step forward, and then another, drawn by the talisman's power. The figure moved again, closer this time, its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness, locking onto hers. It was coming for her. She could feel Itat's presence wrapping around her like a noose, tightening with every step she took. A branch cracked behind her, the sound sharp and sudden, breaking the silence of the woods. Emma whipped around, but there was no one there, just shadows, more shadows. She couldn't tell what was real anymore. The world around her seemed to be warping, shifting, as though the forest itself was alive, pulsating with energy. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and Emma stumbled backward, her mind racing with questions. What was this creature? What was the significance of the talisman? What had happened to Lucas? As she backed away, her foot caught on something solid. She fell to the ground, the talisman slipping from her hand. It clattered against the rocks, its light flickering and dimming for a moment before it glowed brighter than ever. When she looked up again, the figure was right there. It was towering over her, its eyes burning with a fierce, otherworldly light. Emma felt her chest tighten, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stared into the creature's eyes that seemed to recognize her, to know her. In the stillness of the night, the whispers grew to a crescendo. They were all around her now, inside her head, until it felt like the very world was closing in on her. She could feel her mind fracturing, the fear threatening to consume her. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished, fading into the shadows, as if it had never been there. The whispers stopped, the air returned to normal. Emma sat frozen, the talisman lying just out of her reach. A cold, unsettling silence filled the air. The figure had gone, but Emma knew this wasn't over. The Deertha creature had been close, closer than she ever thought possible. But why had it appeared? What did it want with her? She reached for the talisman again, her hand shaking, and as her fingers closed around it, she felt a sudden sharp twinge of pain, like a fire was spreading through her skin. And then, a voice whispered, just behind her ear, "The price is yet to be paid." Cliffhanger. Emma's heart raced as the words echoed in her mind. The talisman had chosen her, and now the forest was waiting for her to understand its true power before it was too late. The final act. The descent into the forest. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as she held the talisman tightly in her hand, her fingers trembling from both fear and anticipation. The forest around her seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if it were alive, watching, waiting. With each step she took deeper into its heart, the weight of the world seemed to press against her chest. The trees, once familiar, now seemed like towering, menacing giants. Their gnarled branches twisted above her like hands reaching down, as though trying to hold her in place. The map, old and worn, guided her toward the sacred ground, toward the place where her brother had vanished. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just following a map. She was being led. The talisman in her hand hummed with power, and she could feel it pulling her forward, urging her onward. But where exactly was it leading her? The whispers, those soft, ethereal murmurs, were back, louder this time, more insistent. They slithered through the trees, creeping into her ears, filling her mind with the promise of forgotten secrets. Emma tried to push the voices away, but they pressed in, relentless, as though they were in her very bones. The price is yet to be paid. Her pulse quickened at the thought of the mysterious words, her mind racing. What did they mean? What price? And why was it tied to her? To Lucas. She stumbled forward, her boots crunching on the forest floor, and as the trees began to thin, she saw it. The mansion, the place where everything had started. But it was different now. The mansion no longer stood as a dilapidated, crumbling ruin. No, this was something darker. The windows were dark, the structure looming as though alive, watching her approach. The once forgotten mansion had transformed into something more ancient, more powerful, more dangerous. It seemed to pulse with energy, as if the very walls themselves were breathing. Every step Emma took felt like she was being drawn into something far bigger than she could comprehend. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, but there was something else, something more unsettling. A faint, metallic taste lingered on her tongue, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Her heart pounded harder in her chest, the fear rising within her. And then she saw it. The deer. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes locked on hers. A creature of legend, majestic and terrifying. Its fur shimmered in the pale moonlight, its antlers twisted in unnatural shapes, reaching out like skeletal hands. The deer wasn't just a creature, it was alive with power, pulsing with an energy that was both ancient and terrifying. Emma felt the force of it in the pit of her stomach, a deep, primal fear that she couldn't quite place. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. It was as though the creature had ensnared her, its gaze holding her in place. It was then that she noticed something else, something that chilled her to the bone. The trees surrounding the mansion were marked. Carved into their bark were the same symbols from the talisman, symbols that seemed to glow in the moonlight. The markings were everywhere, etched into the stone walls of the mansion, scattered across the ground, and even carved into the very air itself. It was as if the entire forest, the very land, was branded with the power of the Arcadian deer. Emma's mind raced. The talisman, the markings, the whispers, they were all tied together. But to what? What was the creature? And why had Lucas disappeared? Was it the deer's doing? Suddenly the talisman flared in her hand. It pulsed with a fierce, unearthly light, causing the air around her to tremble. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and Emma dropped to her knees, clutching the talisman to her chest as if it could somehow protect her. Then, a voice. A voice not in her ears, but inside her mind. The price is yours. Her eyes widened in terror as the deer took a step forward, its hooves sinking into the earth with a heavy thud. Emma could feel it now, the pressure building in her chest, the force of the creature's gaze pressing down on her. The talisman burned hot in her hand, a searing pain spreading through her veins. She gasped for air, her throat tightening as the world around her began to spin. The forest seemed to close in, the trees bending inward, the shadows shifting as if alive. The mansion, the deer, the very earth beneath her feet, it was all alive, all part of something that was far beyond her understanding. Her mind began to crack, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She had come this far, but she wasn't ready. She hadn't known the price, hadn't understood the power she was dealing with. And now, it was too late. The deer loomed closer, its eyes burning with an ancient hunger. The talisman's light flickered and dimmed, and Emma's hand clenched around it as though it were the last lifeline she had. Was she meant to become part of the forest? Was this the fate that awaited anyone who sought the truth about the Arcadian deer? And then, just as the creature's shadow reached over her, a figure appeared, Jonas. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He stood at the edge of the clearing, motionless, as if caught in the very web of the creature's power. "Run!" he screamed, his voice shaking. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Run. From what? From this. But before she could move, the deer stepped forward, its massive form casting a shadow over her. The talisman exploded in her hand, sending a shockwave of power that knocked her back. The ground beneath her feet cracked open, and for a brief moment, the forest seemed to shatter, revealing an abyss of blackness beneath her. And then silence. Cliffhanger. The earth trembled, the air thick with the presence of something ancient and unstoppable. The deer was waiting, and Emma, caught between worlds, realized one horrifying truth. The price was not just her brother's disappearance. The price was hers. Revelation of the deer's true nature. Emma stumbled backward, her mind racing to make sense of the chaos around her. The deer, the talisman, the whispers, the markings, it all led to one horrifying conclusion. But she couldn't bring herself to accept it. The truth was too monstrous, too terrifying. The air was thick with an unnatural tension as Emma struggled to catch her breath. The sacred ground, the very place her brother had disappeared, to hum with a dark, ancient power. The deer, which had once seemed like a myth, a mere legend, now stood as a harbinger of something far older and more sinister. Suddenly, everything clicked. The deer was not a creature at all. It was a symbol, a representation of something far more insidious. The truth was written not in the stories the villagers told, but in the very fabric of the forest itself. The deer, its glowing eyes, its twisted antlers, was the face of a pact made long ago, a pact between the village and an ancient entity that ruled over life and death. The realization hit Emma like a tidal wave. The village had made a sacrifice, a blood offering to something far more powerful than they could ever hope to control. And the deer, this terrifying creature that had haunted her every step, was nothing more than a mask, a symbol of the cost of their pact. Her brother Lucas had uncovered the truth. He had discovered the connection, the cycle of sacrifice that the villagers had been part of for generations. But in doing so, he had triggered the ancient forces tied to the legend and had paid the price for it. Her brother hadn't just disappeared, had been consumed. The realization was like a blade through Emma's heart. Her brother wasn't missing. He was gone, taken, sacrificed, just like the others before him. The whispers grew louder, as if they had been waiting for her to uncover the truth. They were no longer vague, empty sounds. They were voices, real voices, ancient voices. They spoke of the pact, of the entity that lurked in the shadows of the forest, always hungry, always waiting for the next sacrifice. But as the pieces fell into place, Emma's sense of dread only deepened. The true nature of the entity was beyond comprehension. It wasn't just a spirit or a demon. It was an ancient force, a being of unimaginable power that fed off the souls of those it claimed. And the villagers, bound by fear and tradition, had kept the cycle alive, offering up their own blood to feed the insatiable hunger. Twists and turns. Emma's pulse raced as the truth unfolded before her, revealing the terrifying role the villagers had played in all of this. They weren't just afraid of the legend, they were complicit in it. They had willingly entered into the pact, generation after generation, believing that by feeding the entity, they could keep their village safe, keep themselves safe. But it was a lie. Each sacrifice only fed the hunger of the entity, growing stronger with each passing year. And now, Emma's brother had become part of that cycle. He hadn't stumbled upon the truth by accident. No, Lucas had been chosen. He had uncovered the entity's secrets, and in doing so, had sealed his fate. The villagers had tried to warn Emma. They had given her cryptic clues, hoping to guide her away from the truth. But it was too late. The cycle had begun again. She could feel it now, the pull of the entity. It was closer than it had ever been before. The talisman in her hand pulsed with an ominous energy, as if it were a conduit for the entity's power. It had led her here. It had shown her the truth. But what would it cost her now? As Emma connected the final dots, something caught her eye in the distance, the faint glow of a lantern. She turned, and there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Jonas. His face was pale, his expression twisted with fear. But it wasn't just fear. There was something else in his eyes, something dark, something knowing. Emma. His voice was trembling, barely a whisper. You shouldn't have come. Cliffhanger ending. Emma's heart raced as she took a step toward him. But something was wrong. The air had thickened. The shadows had grown longer. The whispering voices were no longer just in her mind. They were all around her, wrapping themselves around her like chains. The talisman burned hot in her hand, the pain almost unbearable. Jonas took a step back, his eyes wide with terror. You don't understand. You've unleashed it. You've made it stronger. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and a deep guttural growl echoed from the darkness of the forest. The shadows seemed to move, shifting, twisting as if alive. And in that moment, Emma realized the full extent of the terror she had uncovered. The entity was awake, and it was coming for her. As the growls grew louder, the light from Jonas's lantern flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the forest floor. The deer, its glowing eyes locked on Emma, appeared once more from the darkness, but this time it was no longer just a symbol. It was the manifestation of the entity itself, an embodiment of death and hunger, ancient and unrelenting. Emma's body froze. The cycle was complete. Her brother had paid the price, and now it was her turn. Would she be able to break the pact, or would she, too, become a part of the cursed cycle? The forest seemed to close in around her, the darkness swallowing everything in its wake, as the whispering voices echoed one last time in her mind. It's too late. And then, nothing but silence. Cliffhanger. The entity's presence loomed closer, its power suffocating. Emma stood at the edge of the abyss, the weight of the pact, and her brother's fate hanging over her like a guillotine. Would she be able to escape the cycle, or would she, too, become part of the legend? Final confrontation. The night was alive with a palpable tension as Emma made her way through the village, the talisman still burning hot in her hand. Every step felt heavier, the air thicker with the oppressive presence of the entity that had haunted her every waking moment. She had tracked Jonas down, the man who had always been a shadow in the corner of her mind, and now she faced him, his eyes dark with guilt and fear. Jonas stood at the heart of the village, under the twisted branches of the ancient oak. His lantern flickered weakly in the wind, casting eerie shadows that danced like ghosts around them. But it wasn't the village's shadows that Emma feared now. It was the darkness within Jonas. "Jonas," Emma said, her voice shaking but her resolve hardening. "I know the truth. You've been hiding it all along." Jonas sighed deeply, his face twisted with pain and regret. "You've come too far, Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. The legend, it's not just a myth. It's real. And your brother, he was chosen to pay the price for breaking the pact." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Her brother, chosen. She could barely comprehend the words, but deep inside, she knew they were true. The village, the deer, the whisperset, had all been part of a cycle of sacrifice that her brother had unwittingly become part of. Jonas's gaze softened with a mixture of pity and sorrow. Lucas uncovered the truth. He found the ancient texts. He learned too much. He broke the pact, and now the entity, the one who controls the deer, demands a new sacrifice. The air grew colder, the wind picking up, as if in response to Jonas's words. Emma gripped the talisman tighter, its power growing, thrumming with dark energy. "What does it want from me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jonas's eyes flickered with fear. "You. The entity has chosen you, Emma. Your bloodline, your connection to the forest. You're the key to ending the cycle. But it comes at a cost. You must choose sacrifice yourself, and the village will be spared. Or refuse, and the cycle will continue. The deer, the entity, they'll claim everything." The ground beneath them trembled, as if the very earth was protesting. Emma's heart raced. The weight of Jonas's words crushed down on her chest. The fate of the village, the lives of the people she had known all her life, hung in the balance. But at what cost? Suddenly the ground before her split open, and from the depths of the earth rose a figura. Massive cloaked shadow, its eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the deer's. The air was thick with power, a force that seemed to warp time and reality itself. The creature towered over her, its form flickering in and out of existence, as if it couldn't be fully contained in the world she knew. The deer's power, its ability to control time, wasn't just about the past or the future. It was about choice, the ability to manipulate the present, the ability to turn moments into eternity. And now, in front of her, the entity was real. The closing scene. The air was still, the forest eerily silent after the destruction of the talisman. The tension that had plagued the woods for so long seemed to lift, as though the land itself was taking a long exhaled breath of relief. Emma's body trembled with exhaustion, her every step a struggle as she stumbled away from the heart of the cursed forest. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an ethereal glow over the mist that still swirled around her feet. Her mind was heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. The village was free, the entity was gone. But the questions that gnawed at her, the unanswered ones, the ones left in the shadows, refused to let her go. Where was Lucas? Her brother's disappearance had always been shrouded in mystery, and though the curse had been lifted, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left undone, that somehow the story wasn't finished. With each step she took, the forest seemed to breathe with her, as if acknowledging her presence. The trees stood tall, their branches gently swaying in the night breeze, but Emma couldn't escape the haunting sensation that she was being watched. Her footsteps faltered as she approached the clearing at the edge of the woods, where the forest began to give way to the village. It was there that she saw it. A figure, a deer. At first she thought it was a trick of the mist, the shadowy outline of a creature lost in the fading light. But as she drew closer, her heart skipped a beat. There it was, standing perfectly still, staring at her from the edge of the trees. Its eyes glowing, unnaturally bright, were fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. The creature's form was shrouded in the darkness of the trees, its silhouette both graceful and unsettling. Emma froze in place, her breath catching in her throat. There was something familiar about the deer, something that unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite place. As she looked closer, her blood ran cold. There, carved into the side of the deer's body, was the unmistakable symbol, the same mark that had once been burned into her brother's chest. It was unmistakable, the same pattern of jagged lines, the same twisting design that she had seen in the journals, in the trees, and on Lucas. The realization hit her like a wave. The legend wasn't over. It couldn't be. Was the sacrifice truly complete? Had the entity been destroyed? Or had it only taken a new form, hiding in plain sight? The deer's eyes glowed brighter, its presence somehow both soothing and menacing. It stood still, watching her with a strange, knowing gaze, as if it knew she had seen it, as if it knew that she could never walk away. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She took a step forward, but the deer remained motionless, its eerie gaze never wavering. The symbol, her brother's mark, burned in her mind, the connection between him and the creature undeniable. She couldn't look away. Suddenly the air grew thick again, the atmosphere pressing in on her. The gentle breeze had stilled, and the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her next move. Was this the end? Or had the curse merely shifted, waiting for the next chapter? A soft rustle in the bushes behind her snapped Emma from her trance, and she whipped around, but the deer was already gone, fading back into the shadows from where it had emerged. The mist began to swirl again, and the night's stillness resumed. Emma's pulse raced as she stood in the quiet aftermath. Her mind screamed with questions, with a deep sense of dread. Her brother's fate was still tangled with the forest. The entity's grip might have loosened, but it wasn't gone. The village was safer now. But the world she thought she had freed was now a tangled web of questions and dark histories, and it was clear to her that the legend wasn't finished. As she turned to leave the forest, her eyes lingered on the darkening path behind her, half expecting the deer to emerge again, to lead her deeper into the mysteries yet to unfold. The weight of her brother's absence, the symbol, the deer's haunting presence, it all seemed like a warning. The legend had not ended, it had only shifted. And as Emma stepped away from the forest's edge, she could still feel the weight of those glowing eyes following her, a reminder that some legends never truly die. Cliffhanger ending. Was the creature truly gone? Was the forest finally free? Or had Emma merely unleashed the next phase of a curse that would follow her wherever she went? The deer's watchful eyes burned into her memory, its symbol carved into her brother's chest, and the faintest whisper of something older, darker, still lingering in the mist. What would happen when the deer returned? The answer was a question that would haunt Emma for the rest of her days. Do you think the Arcadian deer is real? Comment your theory below.